Hi gang, today's video is a short little one on the topic of vertex painting. So before this particular demo we were working with very low poly models. We did something in the style of Animal Crossing, and in that case we did a texture mapping and texture painting, right? But those only work really well when you have really nice topology on your model. So the model is the flow of the polygons or the surfaces over the surface of your 3D object. When it comes to this really high poly sculpting, if I switch over here into wireframe, you can see my polys are just super dense, and they sometimes change direction and have little shapes and things like that. So for high poly models, it doesn't make as much sense to try and unwrap this thing and texture map it and paint it like we did before. There are a couple of other things you can do. You can retopologize something, but we're not really going to go into that in the scope of this class. You can also do this thing called texture baking. So you can take small little shapes on that surface, render them into an image that has kind of a false color map, and then that image tells the 3D object how light is supposed to bounce off its surface. So it's a way to kind of have your cake and eat it too, to have small little details, but they're actually just tricking the eye as opposed to being housed in the geometry. Anyway, this is a long way to say that we know what texture mapping does. We know that's good for situations where we have a low poly count and good topology. In this case, we have a high poly count and poor topology, but vertex painting is the way that we're going to solve that. So we know that every single time an edge comes together or a line comes together in the mesh, that's a vertex. So we can also associate each of those vertices with a color. And that's one of the ways that we can get around this issue of topology and poly count. If you want to see how many polys your model is making up, we can go up here into the overlays and we can turn on statistics, and you can see that right now I have about it's 1.2 million triangles as opposed to 600,000 faces. I'll have to look a little more to see what the difference is in there. But the more of these that you have, the more difficult it's going to be on the computer. So sometimes when I'm heading into the next stages, I like to decimate a really high poly model. Sometimes this can help with computers that aren't performing quite as well. So for example, I can look at the teeth where my highest level of detail is, and then I can go in and add a modifier, for example, decimate. Let's come in and make this ratio, say, 0.7. So we're going to try to lose about 30% of these polys. And then if I hit enter, it's going to be a little bit of an operation because there's a lot to think about, but we're going to keep an eye on the teeth down here. And sometimes when you do this, you'll see things shift ever so slightly, and if you feel like everything still looks good, now we have the benefit here of moving from 1.2 triangles to 850,000. So that's a pretty good reduction. Everything still looks pretty good. If you go low enough and the polygons start to get too big, those vertices are going to get too far apart for your colors to look nice as they grade across the surface. So this is really a balance between having a lot of polygons but not too many polygons. And the amount that's too many, that's kind of going to be up to you, how your object is taking color, but also how fast your machine can perform. So let me just go ahead and apply that. I took off some polys, things to look okay, but I'm not going to go crazy. Wait for that to complete. Okay, so if I switch over here into cycles, right now I think I might be in EV. I have a single light. Right now we're not illuminating this object very efficiently, although one thing that I do like is to cast some of these dark shadows into the recesses, like the orbit and the nasal cavity, and also this area down here. But I think I'll find that if I render this, then these areas still aren't getting quite dark enough, and that's especially around the teeth too, right? Because I didn't want to bother coming in here and having to model the little actual gaps we might see in a skull that would let us peer through to that back area. So one of the tricks we can do with vertex painting here is we can sort of darken areas to help out the lighting, and I think that's particularly important in this spot here, because if we zoom in, you can see I'm cheating that, right? That's supposed to be a hole that tucks back into behind the teeth. I can also make sure that I'm viewing this as shaded smooth. Yeah, that'll clean up some of our little chunks in there. Okay, vertex painting. So to start out with vertex painting, you should know that it's not going to show up in the rendered view just yet. So right now I'm in shaded view. I'll switch my object mode to vertex paint as opposed to texture paint. And I have relatively few drawing tools here. So there's just a basic draw. I can blur stuff together and average it and smear it, but it's really just these 4 tools. So if you've worked, primarily in 2D on the computer, you might find this a little underwhelming, but a little goes a long way. Another thing I like to do is just establish a base color for the whole skull. So, you may want to do your research and kind of do some sampling off of a real image of a skull, but I find if I just kind of warm the color up a bit, a little yellow and a little darker there. Now I can go up to Paint, and then I can say Set Vertex Colors. And now the entire skull goes to that base color. And you know what, that might even be a little hard on the yellow. So maybe I'll drag that back towards the center. And then again, I'll just go to Paint and Set Vertex Colors, and that's looking a little bit better. Okay, so like I said, you want to go back in here into the recesses and start to darken them up. And you want to make sure not to go all the way down to black, because that's going to be really apparent what you're getting up to here. I've heard some people reporting that they don't like mirroring in vertex painting. It works super fine for me, so I have mirroring checked right here. So I'm going to go back into my bone color, and I'm going to darken it up, and it's not going to seem to be enough, but really I wouldn't get past the halfway point, right? It's going to be pretty contrasty. So let's shrink down our brush a little bit, and I find the best way to do this is to overpaint a little bit. So I'm trying to establish some of the gaps in between the teeth, and you can see that on my computer, this isn't the video slowing down here. The pen does have a little trouble keeping up. So it could be with my computer. I would need to decimate this even further, but I can also just kind of be patient and work with it. So it's possible we could make this a little bit darker, but I think this will just help with the delineation that I'm looking for. And as in some of my previous tutorials, now that we're getting more complicated, it's really hard to make a tutorial where I show the entire thing, because often I'm just sitting in my office chair here for a couple hours and going back and forth and adding stuff and erasing it and so on. So I'm just going to show you an example of how to get the type of effect we're looking for, but then I'll leave it up to you to perfect that and really give it some more time. Okay, so we have that established right there. So now what I can do is come back in with my color, and then I can sample it right off the surface. And then, although that still looks a little dark, let's see here. Let's grab the eyedropper. There we go. So I'm looking for that lighter color, and maybe with the teeth I would even make something slightly different, maybe slightly yellower. You'll want to write down these hex values if you can so you can return to them. I don't think that there's a way to do palettes in this particular setting. Could be wrong. Wow, that's looking a lot greener than I want it to be. So I'll come back in, maybe sample off some more of this white. So I think the sampling is actually might even take into account the lighting a little bit, which makes this a little harder to get back to where we want to be. So I might have to kind of fake it a little bit. Let's see if something like that. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, and maybe the teeth can be a slightly different color. So now I can come back in, and then I can more carefully re-illustrate these teeth so that I get all that sort of front piece. Unless you want those teeth to look a little bit dirty. I just hit undo, and it undid everything. So it's going to take a little bit of practice in figuring out, the pressure sensitivity of your pen, and the fact that the process is a little laggy at this amount of polygons certainly doesn't help. But there we've delineated the teeth a little bit more. Yeah, so I can come in here from the side and do this. It's nice and slow, so my poor old 2017 can keep up with what I'm doing. And it's interesting because my rotation of the image isn't lagging at all, so I guess vertex painting is maybe just a little more computationally intensive. Okay, so we get something like that going. So at the moment, it still seems a little cartoony, so you might want to get in here and blur it down a little bit. So for example, I can come in with a larger brush stroke and then try to break those edges a little bit so it doesn't look quite so hard. This is sort of the subtlety work that you're going to be doing. Average is another one I can come in with as well. You can see that's going to have a little stronger of an effect. So I'm just going to do part of the teeth, and then we'll compare them to the other part when we go ahead and light this thing up. I can do the same thing with the eye socket, although this one's going to be a lot easier. Let's go a little bit darker on the eye socket. Come in with draw. And then, whoops, oh, weird. I guess I lose my color when I move between tools. I do have Y selected, so I'm going to turn that off so that we can see the effect of this on one side and not the other. This is just a little piece of geometry that's hinting at the channel for the nerve that heads back to your brain. I could, color that even darker if I wanted to. And what I'm going to do is sort of overdo this, right? So I'm going to come out here with this hard edge. And I think a lot of depictions of skulls, right, we don't tend to see them depicted in really high-key light. So helping this thing be dramatic is going to make it feel more realistic. Unless, I was putting this into like a medical setting or something. But now I can come in with average, and I can... This one I find a little bit hard to use. Come in here real light with the brush. Maybe that's too light. Let's try average again. You can pull down that strength. So, classic stuff. Do as I say, not as I do. You're going to get in here and do an awesome job of this, and I'm just going to kind of give you a sense of how the tools work generally. Something like that. Okay, so let's say that you've gotten there and done a really fantastic job. You can start to see how these two different sides are done. And if I head over to render, at first I'm not really going to be able to tell what I did, and that's because there's one more thing we need to do in the node editor. Oh, I'm sorry, shader editor is the one that I'm supposed to be looking for. Right, it's easy to get these confused. Okay, so I got the shader editor, and by default it's going to give me these two little windows, and I'll come down here and say Shift-A, go over to input, and then we're going to add in a vertex color. Drop that node right there, attach the color output into the base color input, and now when we come over here you can see that the visual has changed a little bit. And then we're not really going to touch this again. So it looks complicated, and it certainly can be, although we're not using all the features, so now we can just leave that thing alone. But now my vertex colors are hooked up to my shader and my material, and I can start to get in here and do a better job with illumination. So this should make it pretty clear, right? You can see on this side the eye socket looks nice and dark. On this side it looks kind of washed out. Down here we have the shadow coming in from sort of the, I wouldn't call that the lip exactly, but where the bone of the maxilla meets the teeth is doing part of the job casting that shadow, but the other part of the job is being taken care of with our texture paint. So now what you can do is get in here and improve the lighting. You can give it a background. You can decide to potentially go look at pictures of actual bones and start to figure out maybe where they're more yellowish and more whitish and so forth. You can also, if you want to, experiment with things like the sutures, right? So all these panels of bone, they kind of form together after we're out of the womb and grow and so forth. And so you wind up with this really distinctive looking kind of crack on the surface. But one of the issues about our resolution and so forth is that you just might not have enough to work with. So let's say we go back down to Vertex Paint. And I'm going to go in here, get my tools back. And I can move my brush size really small. Let's make it just about as small as it goes. And then I want to paint this thing black, but why am I not getting the option to do that? Go back into shading mode. Interesting, I seem to be missing a menu. Let's look at, does it show status bar? And the color still appears to be there. Interesting. So I'll have to try to figure out why that thing is lacking, but at the moment it still lets me express what I'm trying to, which is you'll see that if I try to paint this in here real small, my resolution is chunky enough that Vertex Paint is not giving me a nice little refined line. So I could hit undo and blow up my brush size a little bit and do something like this, and I start to get a more refined line. However, of course, that's way too big in order to express the suture. Now my other option would be coming in here and going, for example, to sculpt mode, and then we could come back in here with the actual tools that change the geometry. So let's say I'm drawing sharp, and I come in and try to make a track like that. That also doesn't have enough resolution, so at that point I might have to remesh and so forth. However, if I come in here to remesh, so let's say Shift-R, and then we move this down until it's lower. If I go to Control-R, this might mess with our vertex painting that we've already done. So let's give this a try, and then we'll take a look at it and see if it screws up the other parts. So now I've got a little bit more resolution to work with, so maybe that's enough resolution to start putting in my suture. And if I move this over into... Aha! So you can see when we remeshed, we screwed up the vertex painting that we had done. So what this may involve is that you get in here and you experiment with just a little bit of vertex painting to get a feel for it. But unlike with modeling, where we have to work from our largest details towards the smaller details, in this case you want to think about what's the littlest tiny vertex painted line that you want to work with, or area. Give that a try, and if it's not working, if you don't have enough resolution, you'll want to address the meshing and the remeshing before you go ahead and commit a bunch of time to the vertex paint, because if we head back over here and remesh, we're going to lose that work. Okay, so play around with those tools, and you can use them to make a really satisfying shot. The last thing that I'll mention, because I think in previous videos I've talked a little bit about if I hit N and go over to View, I've talked about messing around with the focal length here, right? So I mentioned that maybe between 80 and 100 is a way that we're used to seeing photographs of portraits and things that are, head-shaped or skull-shaped. Now I'm realizing that while we were messing around with the view here, what we were not changing is the actual camera view that's going to render out this image. So if I hit the camera here and you look carefully at these squares, note how the distortion changes a little bit, right? So what I was failing to anticipate was that the view can be associated with a certain camera, but the camera itself can have different characteristics. So here, if the camera is selected, now I can come down into Properties and pick it over here. Let's see, I might have to be in object mode to get this done. So we have our camera, it's selected, and then over here I have a camera property. And there's a couple things I can mess around with, but one of those is focal length. So right now, the scene focal length is 80, and the camera focal length is 50. So we want to match those up so we get a better sense of exactly what kind of picture we're going to get, right? Another thing I messed around with too that usually is for stylization, but I found it actually made my image stronger in general, even more realistic, was to change the lens type from perspective to orthographic, right? Which is the equivalent of doing it like this. So, I don't know. It's hard to say, but I feel like in this particular case, the orthographic lens, which usually forces things into a kind of strange orientation, made this feel a little bit more realistic overall to me. So that's how I wound up rendering out my image, something like that. Okay, great. Go ahead and give those techniques a try and see what you come up with.